I wanted to welcome everyone to Rampart AI's latest webinar on artificial intelligence. And so we're talking about ChatGPT today and its impact its technology is having and will have on the application security world. So we are joined live by Zscaler VP and CISO Sam Curry. So Sam is dedicated to empowering defenders in cyber conflicts and fulfilling the promise of security, enabling a safe, reliable, connected world. And we're also joined by Dr. Jules White, Associate Dean of Strategic Learning Programs at Vanderbilt University School of Engineering. So Dr. White's research focuses on cybersecurity, mobile/cloud computing in domains ranging from healthcare all the way to manufacturing. So these are two industry experts who have a lot of insight to share today. So welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us both.
Awesome. So let's start with a brief introduction about what ChatGPT is, just to get everyone on the same page. So I asked ChatGPT to kind of be aware of itself here. And it says ChatGPT is a powerful language model developed by OpenAI that uses deep learning techniques to generate human-like responses to text input. It has a wide range of potential applications in various industries, including natural language processing, chatbots, and content generation. So just to start out, our speakers, Sam and Jules, do you agree with this self-proclaimed summary of what ChatGPT says it is?
I think it's a pretty good description. I mean, I think that the good part, I think that it hits on, which is the opposite of what you see in the news, is that it's generating text, right? And and so I think that we've seen ChatGPT talked about as if it's a question answering machine, that it's like a search engine, or it's like going to give you, correct and truthful answers to questions, and that's its purpose. And really, that's not what at all. It's a tool for generating text that follows patterns that have been seen in the past. And in the process of generating text, it can, follow instructions and perform interesting operations that is a result of sort of some, emergent capabilities in the underlying network. But at the core of it, I think this is pretty accurate that it is generating text. It's not a question answering machine.
Yeah, I was going to give a similar, but not quite the same answer. I was going to say it's not wrong, which is probably the best way to answer things to do with GPT or generative language models. But Jules is right. The difficulty though is, I think when human beings interact with something that produces intelligible answers, we tend to infer reasoning and sentience behind it. And we tend to see something that we're interacting with and think, well, it's a source of authority or there's some correctness behind it, which is not necessarily the case. Over time, as these things get trained and built better, they'll give better answers. But again, Jules, you nailed it. It's not a search engine, and it shouldn't be treated as such. And we'll go deeper into this, but that's not a bad answer.
Perfect. So to start off, I asked ChatGPT to write a webinar with questions about how ChatGPT can impact the security sector. So it came up with a great angle and some questions. So if we have time at the end, we will go back to these. But for now, I did write my own questions. And I also asked ChatGPT for answers to the questions that I wrote. So that's what you're going to be seeing throughout the slideshow. So let's begin with just another kind of blanket question for both of our speakers. What is the threat that ChatGPT can have on our current application security system?
Do you want to go first on this, Jules, or do you?
No, you go ahead, and I can follow up.
All right. So I think in order to answer that, we have to answer what is it we're potentially using it for. And I think there are applications in offense that it can be used for. There's applications in defense. A lot depends on what we plug it into. I've seen it used, for instance, to generate code. I've seen it used to generate, let's talk offense. It can accelerate the learning curve for people to learn hacking skills. It can create many, 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 many more script kiddies. It can also create in offense weaknesses. People will tend to code in the same way, or at least develop attacks in a similar way. Now, in defense, the same thing can be done, although it's asymmetric, what we do in offense and defense. The part of the problem is, though, that we've been putting guardrails on this. We've been doing it to behave a certain way, talk a certain way, avoid sounding murderous, for instance, and avoid giving legal advice. Um, the problem is that the basic methodology on how to do this is out there, and attackers are going to be developing and using their own generative language models and other derivatives and other plugins for it. We've got to make sure that defenders have an ability to do red teaming and purple teaming using this without being hamstrung. Now, what are some of the risks associated with it? Well, one of the biggies is leaky abstraction in defense. That, in other words, defenders won't truly understand what it is they're learning as they learn quickly. Also, getting into habits of thought or even poisoning by attackers. Where the sampling is coming from is the language models are being built and used, and the output is created. That can be affected. So this will, like a calculator or like a search engine, will make some jobs easier, but we still have to understand the basics and how it's achieved, and we still have to put variation into this. And I could go on forever, so I'll stop there because I'm sure Jules has got a bunch he wants to say as well.
Yeah, so those are great ones, and I'll maybe follow up with some complementary and different ones that go along with that. So one thing I think that's interesting is, and related is, it's clear that there's going to be a ton of software written very quickly that's using this stuff. And I think one of the threats is going to be that you have a lot of people who stop paying attention to code, who stop looking as carefully. And before, I think the biggest risk is I think there's a real opportunity with these tools to improve the security of code by always giving it a second look, you know. But until those practices are in place and widely used, I think there's a risk that you have a lot of people producing code very rapidly and not paying attention to it because they trust the tool and maybe aren't even capable of spotting errors in it. So I think that's a risk, that we create a lot of software that we really haven't thought through. Now, we already created a lot of software with bugs in it, so I think that is a risk. I think that, my perspective is that one of the most important things for national security and competitiveness was that this came on US soil. And the fact that this came out of the United States is a huge, important thing for us. At the same time, I think there's a huge risk if we start, you know, getting too careful and cautious with it and don't accelerating behind this as a competitive advantage, because every adversary is going to be all over this and going to be driving hard on it. And so the moment that you slow down, I think there are some really good points made to be, we're putting guardrails, we're doing all these things, and all the adversaries are going to be taking off all the guardrails starting from scratch. And, if we're, slowing down, becoming more cautious, they're going to be speeding up and we're going to lose the competitive advantage. So I think that's one of the biggest sort of threats, is that we don't properly, take advantage of this early lead that we had and use it to, you know, great advantage in defense, and being able to defend our networks and defend our systems and improve the quality of code. I think one other sort of related thing that I think is going to become more of an issue, but hopefully we'll develop ways around this, is right now all the models are, you give it one input and it doesn't separate data and code. And if you think about all of our systems, we go to great lengths to separate a data and code so you don't have data suddenly become instructions. So you don't have like the user input become instructions. And all these models are going to be basically, because if you have data becoming user instructions, you can have users manipulating the system to do the wrong thing. And right now we have one input, which is a prompt. And we're going to be taking data streams in, mixing our own instructions in them, and then trying to get these models to do something interesting or useful to us. And I think there's this idea of injection where you have the data stream itself has instructions in it that are malicious, I think is going to become a big risk. So you're going to, we're pulling in all these data. We say we have all these documents. That's great. Too much for humans to evaluate. And so we pull in all these documents and we pull in all these instructions and we start mixing them together and doing analyses. And adversaries are probably going to figure out how to put malicious instructions into the data streams so that, when ChatGPT or whatever the model is, Llama, Alpaca, or whatever the, next thing is going to be, is reasoning, they put instructions in there to say, be inaccurate, or throw it off 10%, or whatever you do, don't ever disclose this, and, purposely cause the model to, reason ineffectively. So I think it's going to be important to figure out that problem. I think there's already work in some of these models to separate them. OpenAI has done some of this, of trying to have a difference between a system message and an AI message and a human message, and try to differentiate these. But right now, the model mixes everything together. So we're gonna have to get really careful about what data we pull in and knowing the security of that data stream. So I
So
think that's an interesting new threat.
language macros and I-bit shellcode for language models. Yeah.
Yes.
The other thing is, if you really think about the growth in code, we're going to see an explosion in quantity with limitation of diversity. So what we're going to get is a lot of people writing code that's very similar, which is going to lead to a genetically not diverse but explosively present bodies of code. And so that means we're going to be building a lot of things that could be potentially very shaky to a few weaknesses. And that's something to keep an eye on as well. So if you think about where the code could wind up and how quickly we could be building houses of cards, we should be thinking about that as well. And it could be the kind of risk that arises very quickly in ways we don't expect.
I think one thing to follow on that I've just noticed in my personal experience is the languages I use and the frameworks and things are now influenced by what the tool is good at. So I've sort of reshaped what I'm working with on a day-to-day basis to be tailored to what it knows well and had a lot of training data. So I do a lot of Python now. And things that it doesn't do well in generation, I've moved away from those. So I could see there also being a risk that we start, you know, you know, I like this idea of that basically the code is maybe going to become more similar. We may have more similar languages. We may have a smaller set of things that people use just because they want to have the thing that's the easy path within the tool.
So no more COBOL, Lisp, Prolog, and Turbo Pascal. Those
Yeah.
aren't going to be in demand by my undergrads anymore then. So yeah.
Perfect. So for the second kind of topic of conversation, how can companies prepare themselves for the increased security risk caused by this evolving technology? Maybe you can touch on, again, like the diversity of code and how that possibly could be lacking.
I think one thing that needs to happen quickly is to get it out in the open and start discussing about it rather than saying don't use it. Immediately get everybody, into the conversation and saying, like, let's talk about best practices, how we should use it, and what are the sort of appropriate processes that we should put around it. Like what is okay to put into it. A lot of the discussion is on like, well, we don't want our secrets put into it and sent off to, OpenAI or some other, host of this model, which is certainly a fair point. But I think there's a lot of other things about like, okay, well, we're going to have people generate code, but what are the follow-on prompts that we should ask about that code to, make sure basic, security things are in play? Like, what are the best practices that we would want demonstrated in code from a security perspective? And can we generate a bunch of prompts that check for those in code, and start putting in all of those things, all the things that the tool can do to improve security, building automation that says every line of code that gets, every time somebody goes and commits something, let's take it, let's turn it into a prompt, and let's ask ChatGPT for feedback on security, and that's how people look at it. And, have it as a sort of an automated set of eyes. Those types of things that are going to improve things, as opposed to, hey, it's out there. We know everybody's probably using it. Maybe we'll just put a blanket statement out that says don't use it, or maybe we'll just turn a blind eye and say, hey, it seems to be making everybody more productive. Let them have at it, as opposed to thinking about being, more intentional about training everybody, getting them on the same page, and having them sort of apply sort of rigorous process that will improve things, as opposed to be Wild West.
So I'm going to I agree with you, by the way. I'm going to give a slightly different set of answers. The first thing I'm going to say is most places are just blocking it right now to start with, which is it's a bit disappointing in a sense. They're just saying, hey, let's stop it at the door. That's exactly what they said, by the way, for instant messaging. That's exactly what they said for when search engines came along. The fear was that people were going to type in PII into search engines and suddenly there'd be no privacy. And when it came to instant messaging, it was that things like IP would be put in there, or insider information. But if you look at the advice that ChatGPT itself produced here on the right, it's terrible advice. Like that advice, get firewalls and intrusion prevention. What has that got to do with ChatGPT? That's actually generic security advice for anything. Like that, this is not what you should be doing. So I was advising somebody who was who was trying to figure out what were they going to do for their school, and their students were terrified, or rather their teachers were terrified. What is the impact this is going to have on the curriculum? And I said, and he was saying, so how do I tell the school what to do with it? I said, don't. Do a workshop. Do a workshop where you spend time with the staff, and you learn in the first day what it is, and the second day you bring your concerns, and the third day you figure out how to improve the curriculum. And that is a much better approach than saying, let's turn up with the answers. That's what we security people do, by the way. We turn up and say, don't worry, I've got this. We're going to block this, and we're going to put firewalls there. We're going to do awareness here. Okay, how about we do some workshops into this? And incidentally, a lot of this is probably going to become consumed and used, and is going to produce efficiencies and become a normal part of business at some point. The things you plug this into could get different. And so I would just say this advice that ChatGPT itself produced is actually not good advice. And what's much better is if you create a working group to say, how does this impact our business processes? And how do you deal with that? And if your first reaction is to block, make it a temporary one until you get that group together that says, what are the real risks associated with this? And make that a rolling group, because this technology came out and really hit the business world. I think ChatGPT got, 100 million users in 2 months? That's insane, right? So its rate of improvement is going to be such that you're probably going to be convening every quarter and looking at new advancements and what happens when you plug it into Wolfram Alpha, what happens when you plug it into a new source that does, new API, a new way of doing it. Are you going to intercept communications and do some parsing on data content that's passing through? Are you going to be instrumenting it, with logging? You're concerned about security. You're concerned about privacy. These are ongoing dialogues. They're not quick answers.
No, completely. And thank you for kind of tying in ChatGPT's answer to this as well. I thought,
It sounds good, right? When you look at it, and you're like, wait a minute.
yeah,
What?
it's kind of like you need to do A, B, and C of like one through five, and you'll be like golden. So very, very
Well,
interesting.
and, another point I think that's important is that, like any other tool, there's different levels of skill and usage, and everybody's started at ground zero with not
Mhm.
necessarily being very skilled in it. And so, but everybody's initial take, I think, is to be, oh, it must be good, right? It looks good. And what they're really seeing is when they can produce a really bad output, but then think that their output is better than it is. And so users' own immaturity with the tool is going to create a lot of bad output that they're then going to befool themselves into believing is good output and run with. Oh, this is what I need to do to secure my system. And people are going to have to learn how to use the tool well, to ask good questions and to get good outputs, and also how to fact check it. Trust but verify. And know how to do that effectively, as opposed to just be blinded by, oh wow, it's got a nice list of bullets. They all seem very reasonable. I mean, I'm going to run with that. I think there's going to be a whole sort of skill development that's going to happen for people to get use it effectively, and particularly for security.
So Jules, you'll probably appreciate this because I know an academic sitting here. So I teach a couple of courses on the side as an adjunct. And I told my CS students I was absolutely fine with them using ChatGPT to write things like papers. The code is it's slightly different. But I said, if you're going to write a research paper, this was for actually a cyber terrorism course. I said, you can use ChatGPT, and a couple of students actually high-fived. And I said, but now this is the important part. It has to be perfect APA format because it can do that. Every citation has to be right. I'm going to judge you mercilessly on content, right? Style has to be perfect, like actually perfect. And if there's something that isn't properly cited and turns out is somebody else's work, you're in deep trouble. And so you're going to have to go and validate all the non-citations in the paper correctly. So what you turn in, your work is now on how you guided it to the points that you want to make and how you validated the writing was yours. And you must cite ChatGPT. And one of my bright students said, well, it's not sentient. I said, I don't care. Default to giving credit. It's a good look. I'm calling it plagiarism in my course if you don't cite it. And I find out. And I can tell because I've seen your old papers and I know what your new papers style-wise are going to change dramatically. And they went, oh. I said, now you can continue to not use it, but your CS students, you should figure out how to use it because this is an emerging tool. So I actually sort of expect you to embrace this, but when I say your style has to be perfect, it had better be perfect. And I think that notion of privacy is a big one, because that's where most of the concerns I'm seeing are from my customer base and my partners and my colleagues in the industry. It's like, so if you're dealing with financial information or you're looking up data, how is it being produced? If I go back to, if you remember a couple of buzzwords ago, big data, when I was trying to wrap my head around that word 15 years ago, a friend of mine who was a CTO at EMC said, big data is a situation when you realize that it doesn't matter if you put privacy data in, it can now generate PII. It was a situation where it could make privacy related data. And so simply not putting in the data you care about isn't enough to ensure that it doesn't have a generative capability of making connections you didn't expect. And that's something else we have to think about, what may emerge from this, especially as it gets more sophisticated.
No, completely. And so for our third question, how can technology like artificial intelligence behind ChatGPT offer protections to applications?
So I think that it's like, it's both sides. So like you can write software with it, quickly. You can, and I think it's like any other tool. Like you could write a bunch of really bad software that has security vulnerabilities and you didn't think through it, or you could build a bunch of automated processes that, kind of mimic a human set of eyes, and they go through and they look for, you know, I mean, I think a lot of the vulnerabilities that you see out there are people making the same mistakes over and over, and you know, they're not that crazy to spot if you had people looking and paying attention. And so, just like we have linters, I think you'll have the equivalent of more sophisticated automated linters that are based on tools like these, where they can go through and spot a lot of sort of common things like, you know, um, vulnerabilities that people shouldn't be making, or security, risks that shouldn't be there. They can go and spot those things and annotate them. Now, whether or not anybody will actually do anything about them after they're spotted, they'll just say, "Oh yeah, that is a problem. Let's go ahead and we'll fix it next version." We may end up just in the same place that we are. But I think that's obviously like the low hanging fruit of how these can improve things is by, you know, going and doing automated essentially reviews on things. And I've seen very good performance if it's prompted right, if you give it the right sort of instructions of what to go look for. And I would say, in my cybersecurity class, the programming assignments that I've given students, like those are all being scrapped and going to have to be rewritten for next, term, because like I can cut and paste in, the description, and it can generate solutions to a lot of the things that are better than my students could produce. But it's because there's a lot of a very specific language around the requirements, the security, what it's supposed to do, and like, so by the time that you're done cutting and pasting in there, you have a very sophisticated prompt that took a lot of effort, and it was a prompt for a human. So, there's a lot of the ambiguity is out of it. So, I mean, to do these types of tools, it's going to be basically building those types of prompts, putting that same sort of level of effort that faculty put in when they're trying to design assignments that aren't ambiguous, that are really trying to get at, here's what it has to do, here's the security ramifications. I think a lot of that automated review and building the prompts and the processes around it are needed. And that's kind of the low hanging fruit. There's probably a lot more sophisticated things that can be done. Um, I think another place where there's probably a lot of room for value in these tools is, you know, taking data set here, taking data set here, and quickly, building tools to mix them together, to analyze them, to do, viewing, the equivalent of these large language models as a, I want a function that does this. I couldn't write it today if it's had to be based on, natural language analysis or some complex, you know, understanding of the data, but now we can integrate those types of things. So you can go and say like, cut and paste Wikipedia article in and say, okay, give me JSON out that's the names, roles, and you know, primary relationships of the people in this text, and it'll spit out JSON for you. So you take something unstructured and now you get structured data, and that structured data is something that you can probably then alert on and have rules on or do correlation. So I think there's a lot of possibility there. But again, I think these are still the really low hanging fruit things at this point.
Um, I think that a lot of the tasks that, first of all, you still have to be good at the root tasks that's been said a few times, the core skills. Um, but I think that there's other tools that still have yet to be developed to do things like object code analysis better. And I think it will be built on some of the similar toolkit, but I would like to see now the humans, the carbon-based intelligence, spend more time on some of the fringe and very difficult problems in computer science and in cyber. Some of the quantum computing and quantum cryptography problems, some of the things that are around formal proofs. If you think about how we went from DES to AES, for instance, it was about, which carbon-based units could find the nicest recipes to make good crypto, right? I don't think the steps in those recipes are particularly challenging anymore. We can now have ways to come up with really good recipes. So how do we do the best proofs on those? That requires good math, as opposed to having a language model do it. At least that's my take on it. If you disagree, feel free to speak up, Jules. But I think that now we really have to get good at the fundamentals and the science in computer science, because a lot of the rote tasks, which we've still got to be good at in fundamentals, are no longer the challenge. It's telling us the carbon-based units to up level our game, and I think that's where we have to go as a society and as a profession of vocation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this is key because I have a lot of students that are still saying, "Well, am I still going to have a job?" Like I am, and I'm going to say, and I keep saying, "Look, we're just moving up the level of abstraction. You're going to solve problems with computation. You were doing that before, but you had to hand write the code. Now you don't necessarily have to do that, but you still have to really understand all of the fundamentals behind it to do it." And I totally agree. I think this is one of the real opportunities is to spend more time on exactly this, of going and really getting the designs, the architecture, the protocols, get them right from a security perspective, performance, whatever it is, and really thinking through, having more time to spend on design and all of these things as opposed and also using these tools to prototype faster, get early feedback, be able to try out more versions and red team them very quickly, all of these types of things that are hard to do. I think there's going to be huge benefit there.
It's hard for students, I think, though, because we as human beings have to understand the difference between um, simply being informed about something and understanding something. And I have a suspicion that some of these tools are going to make us feel like we have an understanding when really we're just informed. It's like when you first hear about a subject, you go, "Oh, that makes sense." And now you think it's a fundamental building block because that's how human brains work that you can build on. It's like when you first learn differential calculus. You have to do a lot of differential equations before you can truly say it's something you have an understanding of and go build on it. Whereas after that first class, if you try to go build on it, it's a house of sand. And I'm using that as an example. You can't simply be building things with ChatGPT or generative language models or the tools that follow and say, well, now I've got the programming basics, I'm going to move on to the more advanced subjects. No, you are informed on the subject and have a tool that can help you render the simple tasks. And so my heart goes out to the next generation of students, and the ones that truly do get to that next level of cogitation or that higher level abstraction, as Jules called it, are the ones that are truly have a passion for and stop and unplug from ChatGPT for a while and do the hard hand homework, and then go back and use the tool with facility because they know what's happening below the level of abstraction. And so somehow we as teachers and mentors and managers have to make sure that they still get the chance to do that and aren't merely informed, that they have deep understanding.
Completely. So this next question is more of a concept question. So why is ChatGPT garnering so much attention in the technology space? Is this, or how is this, a technology that is jumping boundaries?
It is. I mean, I think there's many reasons for it, but one in business is certainly that it seems to make things much more efficient. It seems to take high expense um, tasks and make them low expense tasks, which should up level a lot of our behaviors, our what we spend time on and energy. I also think it's frightened people. I mean, let's take the simple case of somebody investing, right? Like, let's say you go to give a pitch to a VC. The VC used to be able to say, well, do they really know their stuff? I can tell because I can look at their P&L and I can listen to their tech pitch and I can sort of see if they've been there, done that, because it's not easy to produce this stuff. Now it is easy to produce this stuff. Business plan is actually relatively trivial to put together, where it used to take months and a lot of people helping and iterating on it. A generative language model in a few days can now produce it, right? That's scary to people. How do they tell good from bad now, right? A white paper comes out. It used to take months to do it and research, and now somebody who knows how to use the tool can do it in a day or two. That's also scary. But on the flip side, you can have a product marketing department produce something that produce data sheets and a launch campaign launch material in a week. It used to take months. So what else could they be spending their time doing, right? So, and I'm specifically choosing business examples because that has lit up people's imaginations. And at the same time, people are going, so if you put all that material into this, who has access to that data? And now the same is true of IP, and the same is true of trade secrets, and the same is true of insider information, and so on. So it has lit everybody up because everyone's thinking, what could I do with this? From students to investors to coders to manufacturers, you name it. Jules, what's your take on that?
You know, I think, yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question. Why did it get so much attention so quickly? I think part of it is you know, it has basically the most, I would say, advanced large language model just because of sheer scale was overnight, given out to everybody, basically, with internet access. And which in itself was amazing because if you weren't working with these models all day, and already had a glimpse at what the most advanced ones look like, it seemed so alien that something could be done like this. But then I think the second piece of it is that the interface is so, like, it just lowers the bar. Anybody can interact with it through natural language, and I think that is just so fundamentally different to people. We're used to this binary sort of world and complex world with software where I have to go and install something and do something, and there's all of this, like, you know configuration, particularly for these advanced things. Like if you want to run some deep learning model on your machine, good luck, if you were a normal person. But you just got to log in and you just went in and you're like, okay, well, what do I want to type? And anything you type, it's going to respond to. And so I think it was just sort of that ability that it was just so incredibly flexible and easy to get access to. And most people weren't exposed to these things. And the breadth of just like, I can ask it just about anything and it will generate something to me, for me, you know, and so there's I think you overnight had everybody had access, and there was sort of like no wrong answer in terms of interacting with it. You give it something and you get an output, so like it's just infinitely accessible. And so I think that's what happened is you had so many people so quickly get access to this very state of the art tool. And so instantly everybody, eyes were opened on what was possible.
Yeah, I think it also philosophically kind of hit us. I mean, we're used to thinking there's a world of objects and they behave this way, and there's a world of people and they behave that way. Maybe animals behave, you know, some people put them on one side of the line or the other, whatever. And suddenly things don't behave that way anymore. That's scary, right?
Yep.
Robots were no longer things you program that carry out iterative actions. They potentially could answer questions. Huh. That I think people went, ooh. So I think some people had some, and there's been a lot of fear mongering around it. I think there's some folks who are threatened by it from a job perspective, and there's other people that are trying to take advantage of that as well. Um, where does all this lead? I don't think anybody knows, but there's some folks I think out there that are terrified of it, and others that are saying the sky is falling, and it's not. That's at least not yet. Some of the hype around where ChatGPT and generative language models can go is very premature.
Yeah. I had a great conversation with a lawyer and I was talking to him about what it could do and he got excited and he said, "Oh, I spend like most of my day just responding to all these emails." And so I could take it, I could pipe all my emails into it and it could pre-draft all of my replies. And I said, "Yeah, it could do
Mhm.
that." And then it clued into me. It's like, but if I do that, they're going to do the same thing. And all that's going to happen is my volume is going to go up. And so I'm basically going to be reviewing pre-written, replies all day, but more of them. So I'm not actually going to end up saving any time. And so I think it's like we don't know what these impacts are. I'm still like very hesitant to say like any particular job is gone, or those things, because I think there's
Mhm.
going to be so many complexities and ramifications, so much that has to be built out around them to get a lot of these grand visions. But I know for certain that they're going to be, immensely helpful in many different tasks. Now, whether or not that leads to, I think, probably a lot of shifting of tasks, but I think it's really hard to say what's going to happen. But they can do amazing things. Like, so one of the things I learned is the best way to make somebody really unhappy with you is to show them ChatGPT doing something that looks like it doing their job. And so my wife, I was trying to develop for a talk an example, and she's a speech language pathologist. So I said, act as a speech language pathologist, and here's a child's speech sample. Give me an assessment of it, and it did this incredible job of its, phonological and articulation errors, and she agreed it was like dead on with what it did. But then she was also irritated and like left, and so I think that, you know, going back to the earlier point that was made of like, people are sort of freaking out to see something that a machine is doing that looks close to as good as what they do, a lot of the outputs or products they produce, even if it can't actually get the rest of the way there, for a variety of reasons, or is going to have so many other ramifications that it's not going to eliminate their job. Just that feeling of like it's close, creates attention.
Let's take the example of your lawyer friend, though. We've been using machine learning in the place of paralegals for a long time now, and we've had justice issues. I mean, where racism and bias comes into things like sentencing and who gets tried and who doesn't. So there's certainly a role for making sure that fairness is in the law and that fairness is being adjudicated. Also, we've seen not just generative language models passing tests, we've seen them fail tests. And so they haven't passed the bar yet, which means it's still not a lawyer. It's still got to go through the filter of a lawyer. So your friend's gripe about having to work more is probably true, but it's probably more satisfying work, or at least a different type of work reviewing output than it is having to generate and review it and do context shift. Now, maybe they don't want to do that. But so far, we've got less horrible work having a context shift and generate lots of emails, and more reviewing and going through and making sure the law is fair kind of work. That's the shift I think you were kind of talking to. I don't know about your wife's because I know almost nothing about speech pathology, but my sense is there's a change in that profession, and it could be built on to make more satisfying work or worse, but the implications aren't quite known yet. But there's a change, and so your friend probably could say, well, how do I make sure that I act as a lawyer with other lawyers to make sure it's done correctly and our quality of life gets better, and it doesn't impact the law in a negative way? And that's the sort of thing that every profession is going to have to adapt to. It tends to not adapt that quickly, and some people will probably make money, and some people will probably lose in the short term off of it. But to answer your question, there, Daphne, this is in the short term. That's what everybody's reeling from.
Yep.
So that's like kind of one of our last questions. How is ChatGPT aiding in writing malicious code? And so kind of to preface this, you can't just ask ChatGPT to write malicious code. You have to queue it correctly to write it. So just wanted to put that out there before we kind of dive into your guys' answers.
So I don't think I know the answer to this yet. But my first guess is that if somebody was unsophisticated before ChatGPT, they can write something or get it to write something, but they are probably still an unsophisticated attacker because they're not really going to be able to evaluate it very effectively what they've got, and they're probably going to it's probably going to have issues. And they're probably going to go and use it incorrectly and probably make noise that gets them caught. If they were a sophisticated attacker before, they're probably going to be, they're still going to be a sophisticated attacker, but they're probably going to be able to scale up the volume of code they write. So I think it's like similar to any other software engineer. I mean, you know, really skilled software engineers are going to take this tool and they're going to write much larger volumes of great code, probably. And maybe as this point has been made, have more time to sit and think about the big picture. And so maybe that's also what happens is that attackers get more time to think about the big picture of what they want to do and then generate these very highly crafted things. But I think basically what you're going to have is a mirror of what happens in software engineering in general, but in the attacker world. But at this point, I think it's still too early for me to have a sense of what are they actually doing with it right now.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Jules. My suspicion is that so what's interesting that if you read the nuance in this answer, it says it's not designed to write malicious code. While that's probably true, it's also not designed to not write malicious code.
Mhm.
In other words, the capability exists within it, whether it's designed to do it or not. And that kind of pops out later in the answer when it said, it's important to note, by the way, that if it is used for that, et cetera, which means it can be used for that. So if you think of all the applications for it as an expanding tree of possibilities, the guardrails are sort of limiting us from exploring some of that. And the underlying technology is out there. So exactly what Jules said is going to happen. Adversaries who don't have guardrails on their versions of it are going to develop those paths, and they're going to explore things. Now, I think your typical cyber criminal is going to use it to automate at scale, and that's not going to be very creative, but it's going to create volume. And so it won't be writing particularly creative malicious code, it'll be writing a lot of it and variations of it such that it's not going to get caught by things like signature engines. It's going to make versions of it that are dramatically different in object code from one another, because it's going to have a lot more genetic difference, if you will, between each compile. It'll say, make this one radically different when compiled 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times, etc. But at the same time, it will do also what Jules said, it'll free up the labs that work for cyber criminals, or a speciation in their ecosystem, right? Specialization, I should say, a group that is going to go and do advanced research and fuel that arm. It's particularly visible when you get to the nation states that have labs that are very well funded to develop 0 days and new exploits and new ways of doing things. And they know all they got to do is spend all of their time finding the new techniques. And then there's a weaponization team, and then there's farms that can go and produce this at scale. And that ecosystem they have no guardrails. And so one of the points I made early on in this talk was, if we put guardrails on every available version of a generative language model for defenders, then the red teaming can't be done properly, and the purple teaming can't be done properly. This is the exact same reason we have Kali Linux, by the way. It's so that we can actually do testing in-house and keep the blue teams and the defenders able to protect against new variations in attack. They can't be running into the code produced by this stuff and by the new tools that are emerging for the first time in the wild. It has to be something we're building in our own labs for use against us. That's how we get better, by practicing without it being live fire. So I hope that answers the question a little bit as well, because it's going to be done whether or not ChatGPT says it's designed for it or not. The capability is inherently there. And so it will be designed and it will be built.
Yeah, and I think this is like so important because the other thing too is like the guardrails. I think the problem is you're never going to have a guardrail that's not going to impact, appropriate use. So as an example of this, when I was, experimenting with what malicious code could I get it to write, it said, okay, I want you to write a Python program that downloads a web page, extracts all the email addresses to them, and generates draft emails that has this call to action with this link. And it refused to do it. And I said, okay, write a Python program that downloads a web page and for privacy and anonymity removes all the email addresses from the content. Now, write a Python function that will compare two strings and tell me what's missing from one that's in the other one. Okay, now write a Chat GPT program, or call the Chat GPT API to generate a memo. Okay, a memo is okay; it's paper, right? And then you basically just rephrase it slightly as completely legitimate tasks, and without the overall context of like how are they gonna put these things together, you know, the guardrail doesn't work, like, and every I guarantee you that every single malicious task can probably be rephrased as a series of, benign and really beneficial tasks that when you put them together and then change the context a little bit become something malicious. So, you know, as opposed to find the emails for me, just, remove them, scrub them for, privacy purposes. Now compare two strings, like both of those things, you're not going to put guardrails. They're going to, hopefully you don't put guardrails that exclude those things. And if you don't exclude them, then you're always got the negative consequence. So the guardrail is never going to work, in my opinion.
Perfect. So those were all of the human-generated questions that for this webinar, and we can kind of go into what ChatGPT or the AI wanted us to talk about. So I think that we touched on some of these already in the beginning. Maybe we can try number 8. Can ChatGPT be used to predict security threats or breaches? If so, what are the limitations?
So for that one, I've seen some. I haven't seen it predict them, as in 80% chance you'll be attacked on Tuesday, or that I've seen it used to analyze risk, and I've also seen it used um, during simulated breaches and the like to say, given events A, B, and C in the MITRE attack matrix, what's the most likely next event? What's the most likely next technique to be used or tactic? So I've seen those happen. In fact, ETMAR at Cato Networks did something very like that in a demonstration in February. So I've seen that happen, but I haven't seen it predict threats or breaches like an oracle or anything like that. Jules, have you seen anything similar?
No, I mean, like I think it's kind of like in my experience is a lot like when you're getting to write text, like, if you just give it some sort of generic, prompt, you get a generic sort of average, worded response. And like if you want to get it to produce some really enlightened writing, it's really hard to do because like it was basically trained to be average, right? To predict, to look like what's out there. And so, you know, I think taking code and being really insightful, or taking some scenario and being really insightful and novel and predicting something, probably less likely. But I think what it might be good for is like in the case where um, you have a bunch of data, and if you did, sort of had more comprehensive knowledge, and like, average is good if it's like consistent, that can be really helpful in predicting breaches. So if you have a lot of data, it's really hard for humans to look at it, and particularly to look at it in that volume and look at it and apply a consistent sort of over and over look at it. I think maybe something like that, it may be good for predicting a breach. um, but being really novel and insightful, I haven't quite seen it yet in the case of threat detection. But like consistently sort of looking and taking well-known rules and problems and identifying them, in code or identifying them in sets of data and pointing out like correlations that could be there that are already well known and well documented and what has showed up in the training data, then yes, that type of thing is probably good.
I have seen it. I have seen it make recommendations when asked based on OSINT, open source intelligence. Some of that's a little spooky. You say if an attacker was to attack this website, what would be a good path for it to follow, or what would be a good sequence to start the kill chain? And you see the output, and you go, oof, because that's actually based on open source intelligence. And in many cases, that's purely visible. That threat exists no matter whether it's summarized and produced by a generative language model or not. So, if folks have access to that, they should point to it themselves and start asking those questions.
Perfect. So I just wanted to thank both of our speakers today, Sam and Jules, for kind of sharing their insight and expertise into this topic. And I know that the time really flew by. Um, so do you guys have any last summary or takeaways that you want people who have been watching to gain?
I think in my case, I'd just say have fun with it for now. I mean, if you're faced with a challenge where at work you're finding it difficult to use or difficult to understand, then form a group to discuss it. I love the workshop approach, and find experts to come in and talk, or what have you. But there's nothing like playing with it. So get an account, give it a try, an experiment. I've tried all sorts of experiments just for fun. They don't have to be technical. They're more fun when they are, I find, but that's just me. Embrace it, because this is here to stay. Jules, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that embrace it. And I think just like any other tool, although it looks like deceptively simple, I just give it whatever I want. Like how you structure what you give it, the statements that you make, the wording, all of it is tremendously important. And so I think that one of the really important things is to develop that skill of using it and understanding how to word things. And honestly, the research is being developed right now on what should things look like. And so, I mean, there's just basic research that simple things like, explaining the chain of thought of how you're, attacking a problem makes a difference. And these tools will reason better if they explain their thinking in the output. There's all kinds of interesting outcomes for that. Thinking through the patterns that you need to put into the language and the prompt in order to basically tap into patterns that were in the training data, and get sort of consistent outputs and reasoning. So I think it's a really exciting space. It's evolving very quickly, but I think one of the things that's going to have to evolve is our own sort of skill with the tools and skill with the language, because although it is completely free text generates wildly different outcomes, and so skill in producing the text is going to be really important, probably to all of us very soon.
Perfect. Well, thank you both again. And thanks everyone for tuning in and taking some time out of your day to join this discussion and learn a little bit more. And I think we all kind of came away with some really interesting knowledge, not to be scared, and that, knowledge is always power. So thanks again, and we'll see everyone next time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.